Welcome and thank you for joining us on the 2020 webinar, Reclaiming Narratives, Arts Advocacy and Cultural Policy. I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Please bring your attention to the poll located to the left of your screen. We'd love to know who's in the room and who already participates in advocacy. GIA President and CEO Eddie Torres urges us to advocate often and enthusiastically. We're in a federal election year while witnessing our world shift as a result of COVID-19, so it is particularly important to clarify what is and isn't within the boundaries of funders when discussing advocacy and lobbying. However, once those parameters are clear, how can funders be strategic about activating their power and resources to shift narratives and inform cultural policy? Which organizations in the field are already civically engaged in modeling ways to dismantle structures and shift narratives? Well, we're glad to address those questions and many others involving advocacy and cultural policy with presenters Abby Levine, Director of Boulder Advocacy at Alliance for Justice, and Favianna Rodriguez, Co-founder and President of the Center of Cultural Power. Abby Levine serves as Director of the Boulder Advocacy Program at the Alliance for Justice. She provides legal guidance that encourages grantmakers to support advocacy and other nonprofit organizations to participate in policy-making decisions through an understanding of federal tax and election law. Favianna Rodriguez is the co-founder and president of the Center of Cultural Power, a national organization investing in arts and storytellers as agents of positive social change. She's an award-winning artist, cultural strategist, and social movement leader who has partnered with national organizations and progressive advocacy groups to design effective cultural campaigns. We're glad to have them joining us today. At the very end of their presentation, I'll be joining to facilitate a Q&A. With that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Abby and Favianna. Abby, why don't you get us started?
Great. Thank you so much, Sherilyn. It's really nice to be with all of you this afternoon and to be talking today about the importance of art advocacy. And I would just say that I noticed for the poll questions that approximately 70% of you report that you do engage in advocacy, and while 30% say you don't. And I would say that hopefully by the time we finish today's webinar, all 100% of you will recognize that you probably are already engaged in advocacy, even those who may think that you don't. So as Sherilyn said, my name is Abby Levine, and I'm the director of the Boulder Advocacy Program at Alliance for Justice. And first and most importantly today, I just want to say that I hope you, your families, your colleagues, and your grantees are healthy and safe during these extremely challenging and unsteady times. This health and economic crisis that we're in right now illustrates even more important how important the nonprofit sector is to meeting people's needs, whether food, shelter, healthcare, education, and the arts. And it also highlights how important your support of these community-serving organizations is, and how important today's topic, how you can get involved in advocacy and support advocacy, is incredibly timely. That now more than ever, it's important for organizations to be influencing policy decisions, whether it's funding, whether it's who has access, to ensure that our communities are well served. So today I will be providing the information that you need to both fund and conduct advocacy. As you know, one of the most effective ways to leverage your funds is to support organizations that advocate, which has so many multiplier and spillover effects. By influencing public policies at all levels of government, nonprofits have made enormous progress in areas as vital as human rights, environmental and consumer protection, worker protection, accessibility of health care, and so much more. And philanthropic support has been critical to these advances. Now, we'll cover a lot of ground during today's webinar, and I have about 20 minutes. I could spend hours, if not days, talking about these rules, but I promise I won't. What we will do today is really highlight some of the legal rules regarding lobbying, election-related activity, and funding, and grant-making, and how you can fund organizations. We don't expect you to remember everything that we discuss or to walk away as experts on this. our publications, and we have lots of publications and fact sheets that are on our website. And we also have a technical assistance line where we can answer questions after. So first and foremost, there are three things that I hope that you leave today's webinar with. That's a tongue twister. First and foremost, that you can fund organizations that advocate and possibly even lobby. Second, that public and private foundations do not need to prohibit grantees from using grant funds for lobbying. And third, that Alliance for Justice is here to support you and answer your questions as you move forward. So now I will really jump in, but also want to let you know that after today's webinar, we will be sending copies of these slides out. So again, you will have access to these moving forward. So advocacy is really important, and it's one of these most really misunderstood terms. And I think no better than one of the great artists, one of the great authors, illustrators of our time, Dr. Seuss, says it best in the Lorax. Why advocate? That unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. And that's really what advocacy is in terms of speaking out, pushing on issues that you really care about. And as we'll talk about today, that advocacy can be one of the most effective strategies in your philanthropy toolbox to fulfill your mission. I recognize, and I will be the first to say, that it may not be the only strategy, or it may not be the most appropriate strategy. Right now, in particular, when people have lost their jobs, when people are sick, when kids don't have the food that they need, there are a lot of direct services that are really important to provide. But advocacy is a way to ensure that we're providing long-term responses to those immediate needs. And so while advocacy may not always be the immediate strategy, it often can pair with and match with the direct services to meet the best needs of the community. Second, as we'll talk about, funding and engaging in advocacy are legal. Whether you're with a private foundation, a corporate foundation, or a community foundation, corporate giving program, advocacy is legal, and there are lots of ways that you can support organizations. And then finally, there are many entry points and possible roles that you can play. We'll talk about some examples of how different funders are approaching advocacy. But what's important is to know that you need to figure out what's right for your organization, and that while you may look to other foundations to see what they're doing, don't think that you need to model them exactly or that there's one cookie-cutter approach to this. It's really important to figure out what makes sense for your foundation based on your resources, your board culture, your grantees' interests, and what's going on in the community. Now, one of the most important things that I hope you walk away from today's session is that when we talk about advocacy, we're talking about a whole range of activities. And as you can see from the screen, lobbying is a type of advocacy. Partisan political activity, deciding who wins or loses elections, is a type of advocacy, but so much more is as well. Doing trainings like this to help your grantees understand what's possible is a type of advocacy. Engaging in research is a type of advocacy. Doing community organizing is a type of advocacy. Educating legislators is a type of advocacy. Writing op-eds about the role that the arts play in the community and the number of jobs that they fill and what a boost to the economy is a type of advocacy. So as you think about the role that your foundation can play in advocacy, it's really important to think about it in this broad context, and that advocacy really means a whole wide array of things. Some of it will have to do with very, very, very specific public policy and pieces of legislation, but much of it will not. And so again, while we think about advocacy, we really want to think it in its broad sense. And with that, all 501c3 organizations, all of you on today's call, have a right to advocate. Some 501c3 organizations, public charities, have a right to lobby, and we'll talk about what the difference is in just a minute. There are different rules in terms of what private foundations can do versus what your grantees can do, but there's a lot that is possible. So what are we talking about when we're talking about different types of organizations? There are a lot of different types of tax-exempt entities in the tax code. There are 501c3 organizations, there are 501c4 organizations, 501c6 organizations, 527s, 529s, lots of different types of organizations. Most of the groups that we work with and most of the groups that are in the charitable space are 501c3 organizations. And those are groups like us, Alliance for Justice. It's groups like community foundations. It's groups like Americans for the Arts. And family foundations or corporate foundations are also 501c3 organizations. 501c3 organizations are great in that not only do they not have to pay federal income tax, but contributions to 501c3 organizations are tax deductible to donors. And that's really important, particularly at times like now. But there are big differences within the category of 501c3s. There are private foundations, entities like the Barr Foundation, the Kenneth Rainin Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that receive funding from a small pool of sources. And private foundations are subject to many more restrictions. They tend to be entities that are regulated by a family board or people who are really close to the original donor. Other type of 501c3 organizations, groups like Americans for the Arts or community foundations, are what are referred to as public charities. And these groups raise money from a broad array of sources. And probably most, if not all, of your grantees fit into the public charity bucket, as do some foundations, some grant-making entities. So community foundations, like the Rhode Island Foundation, is a public charity, or often referred to in the grant-making world is a public foundation. And I may use the term public charity and public foundation synonymously. All 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates for public office. Us as staff or board members in our individual capacity can still support or oppose candidates, but we can't do so using any organizational resources. But then the rules for lobbying, for weighing in to influence legislation, vary depending on whether we're talking about private foundations or public charities. Private foundations are much more restricted, and I'll get into talking about the specific limits in just a minute. But there are other types of tax-exempt organizations that you may be in touch with and that some of you, frankly, may fund or may want to partner with from time to time. And those include social welfare organizations, groups like Americans for the Arts Action Fund. And while these organizations can't receive tax-deductible contributions, they can engage in more policy work than we as public charities or private foundations can. They can do as much lobbying as they want, and they can, to a limited degree, as a secondary activity, support or oppose candidates. Most of what we're going to be talking about on today's call has to do with 501c3s, but if you have questions about C4s, I'm happy to answer those. So again, private foundations are the most limited in terms of advocacy of all the tax-exempt organizations. Nowhere in the tax code, however, does it say that private foundations, whether we're talking about corporate foundations or family foundations, nowhere does it say that the foundation can't lobby. Rather, the tax code imposes a very hefty tax on any money that private foundations spend on lobbying. And as you can see from this red box, the tax is imposed both on the foundation itself and on the foundation managers, the trustees, the officers, the key employees that approve that. And I've never met a foundation trustee willing to pay that tax. So that essentially serves as the prohibition for private foundations. As we'll talk about, it doesn't mean that private foundations can't advocate, and it doesn't mean that private foundations can't fund organizations that lobby, but private foundations themselves can't spend money on lobbying. Public charities or public foundations can lobby. There are limits to how much we can do, but the limits in many cases are quite generous. And there are two ways that public foundations or public charities can determine their lobbying limits: the insubstantial part test or the 501h expenditure test. And we recommend that most organizations use the 501h expenditure test. We have lots more resources on our website that talks about it. Happy to answer more questions about it. But it provides a much more clear definition for what counts as lobbying, and is actually the same definition that private foundations use to determine what's lobbying and what's not lobbying in terms of what they can spend money on. And one of the great things that you as foundations can do in terms of advocacy is educate your grantees about the 501h expenditure test and even encourage them to use it. So I won't go into, for the interest of time, more details about the test, but let's just say for some organizations, they can spend as much to 20% of their total spending on lobbying. So what counts as lobbying? And again, it's important to know what counts as lobbying so we know what doesn't count as lobbying. Because private foundations can do all the advocacy activity that's not lobbying or that's not supporting or opposing candidates. So just because something may be policy related doesn't mean it's automatically lobbying, doesn't mean it's off the table, and the use of language is really important. So lobbying is a communication with a legislator that expresses a view about specific legislation, or it's a communication with the general public that expresses a view about specific legislation and has a call to action. Now again, I can spend a lot of time walking through each of these elements, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to skip to a few. So we need to have a communication with legislators, but the communication needs to be about specific legislation. Talking to legislators about the importance of music in our schools is not lobbying. You're not expressing a view about specific legislation. On the other hand, saying to members of Congress that if you cut funding for PBS or for the Corporation for National Broadcasting, that Sesame Street will be off the air and we need you to keep funding it, that would be expressing a view about specific legislation. So again, not even all of the communications that you have, that grantees have, even some of the advocacy days that your grantees may have, where they go up to the Capitol, may not be lobbying. In addition, when we're talking about lobbying, we're talking about legislation, what the legislative body needs to vote on. So a lot of policy, such as executive orders and executive action, are not legislation. So urging the governor to issue an executive action is not lobbying. Commenting on rules and regulations is not lobbying. Seeking enforcement of existing laws is not lobbying. And engaging in litigation, not lobbying. So again, a lot of the policy activity isn't lobbying. And then for communications to the public, for the most part, we need to have a call to action. So writing a letter to the editor talking about why Congress needs to keep funding National Public Radio, Voice of America, PBS during these critical times, and talking about the importance of those organizations isn't lobbying. It would only become lobbying in your op-ed when you say, so therefore, call your legislator and tell them to increase funding for the Corporation for Public Radio, for instance. So again, there's a lot that you can do in terms of talking about policy that doesn't constitute lobbying. And again, happy to take more questions about them. But I want to just talk about that again, there are a lot of ways that you as funders can support advocacy. Sometimes it may be that you'll get involved in advocacy yourself and you'll take a position on an issue. Sometimes you may be building your grantees' capacity to engage in advocacy. Sometimes you may convene grantees, and there's no right or wrong answer. But some examples that the Ford Foundation, for instance, has a Just Films program where they fund organizations to create documentaries on social justice issues. The Hewlett Foundation has a whole arts education policy and advocacy granting sub-strategy where they fund organizations that work on arts education. Other foundations, especially community foundations, have gotten involved in efforts to support ballot measures, and ballot measures is treated as lobbying. And this is an example from a number of years ago where the Rhode Island Foundation, community foundation, got involved on a ballot question to raise money to support creative and the cultural economy. Other organizations will encourage the public to write to local news that they support the arts. So, and again, we'll send you copies of these slides so you'll see some of these examples. The Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation, another private foundation, funded some research putting out of how much the huge investment, how the arts create a huge return on investment in New Jersey. So there are a lot of ways that organizations can get involved. And then finally, you as a foundation can support grantees to engage in advocacy. Community or public foundations can make grants specifically for lobbying. You can give money to your grantees and say, we want you to spend this money for lobbying. It'll count against your lobbying limits, but you can do it. Private foundations, on the other hand, can't earmark money for lobbying, but there are two very clear safe harbors in the tax code. You can make general support grants, or you can make specific project grants. And in both of these cases, you don't need to prohibit your use, you do not need to prohibit the use of your funds for lobbying. And we have lots more information on our website. We have sample grant agreements, but general support grants are just what they sound like, where you provide funding to the 501c3 public charity and say use it for your charitable purposes. And we know right now in the wake of the coronavirus, many foundations are doing more general operating support or even transforming some project support into general support, which is great. And that gives you the most legal coverage as a foundation, and it also provides the most flexibility to your grantees. But you can also provide funding for specific projects. And again, we don't have time to go into all the details, but know that we have lots. I'm happy to take questions on it. We'll send you these slides, but that there are lots of ways that you can support the grantees, your grantees, to do the work that they want to do, and you don't need to prohibit them from using the funding for lobbying. And in fact, if they report back and tell you that they've used your money for lobbying, that's okay. There's a big difference between saying these funds are not earmarked for lobbying and saying that the grant cannot be used for lobbying. In the interest of time, I am just going to, I will stop there and just sort of, again, summarize that there's so much that both private and public foundations can do in terms of advocacy. While we're all, as 501c3 organizations, prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates, we still can get involved in candidate education, get out the vote activities, all sorts of nonpartisan efforts to help people understand the voting process. Public foundations, public charities can engage in some lobbying. Private foundations, while you can't lobby directly, you can still fund organizations that do. And all of us can engage in all of the non-lobbying advocacy and all of the advocacy that's civic engagement related. So let me stop there and turn it back over to Cheryl Lynn.
Awesome. Thank you. Take it away, Favianna.
Great. Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, Sherilyn?
I sure can.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to present today. I'm Favianna Rodriguez, and in addition to being the founder and president of the Center for Cultural Power, formerly known as Culture Strike, I am also a co-founder and board member of the East Side Arts Alliance in Oakland, and I'm also a practicing artist. I also have a studio with a small studio staff, and what I'll be sharing to you is largely some of the projects that my organization is engaged with together with other cultural organizations, and that through this time I am supporting art organizations and also artists in weathering this moment, and that includes taking advantage of the SBA programs, the payroll programs, and as nonprofits thinking about how we are going to build sustainable revenue models so that we're able to withstand hardship like this. I also want to give a shout out. I see there's a lot of amazing people from the Bay Area, organizations and like the Eastside Arts Alliance. Roberto Bedoya is joining us, Akanati, Rainin, they both based in Oakland, who have a lot of experience with supporting arts and cultural organizations who are working to build culture change. Art Place America I also see here. So thank you all, because together we have really built a vibrant sector in which art and advocacy and social justice intersect. So I want to first start with grounding us in how art and culture not only are so foundational in this moment, but that really that art and culture is what shapes our understanding of the world. And we are living through a worldview shift, right? And at my organization, we talk a lot about worldviews because we are engaging in issues, whether it's gender justice or climate change or ending white supremacy, and understanding that so much of our political systems and our economic systems are informed by myths and stories. And we call those collections of myths and stories worldviews. And those of us who work in the realm of culture are shaping worldviews. We help people see different perspectives. We touch people's emotions. We are able to share with people an image of a different kind of world. And so our work in the realm of arts and culture is critical to our sustainability as a species and as a global community. I like to think about the elements of lasting social change as landing in either of these three realms, and that those are the realms of culture, politics, and economics. And so all the things that affect us as human beings that are made by human beings happen in these three realms. And often, you know, we think about the work of social change and social justice as happening in the political realm because, you know, the nonprofit structure, which is a structure that's only about 50 years old, right? We have to remember these are young structures. So much of our sector that is doing advocacy work is largely doing advocacy work in the realm of politics, right? And that's when we think of social change, whether it's lobbying or organizing or marching or making our voices known, often we are doing so in order to change policies and laws. And that work is critical. But the work of culture is about changing the imagination, and culture precedes political change. And that is that before people can vote on something or before they can relate to an issue, they first have to understand it in their heart and mind. And a classic example of this is marriage equity. We know that marriage equity was won in 2015, but the narratives and the culture shifts that helped set the stage for that happened in the realm of culture. And that was through TV shows like Ellen. It was through books like the Laramie Project. It was through people in sports coming out. And so in the realm of arts and culture, we have the ability to shape ideas. And culture moves much faster than politics. You know, right now when we even think about the Me Too moment, right, and how it is that people coming out with their stories is changing culture. And while it hasn't changed politics as much as we would like it to, culture is moving and there's a shared new awareness. And so those of us who work in the realm of culture, the work of artists becomes indispensable because it is our work that can help seed new ideas and can actually help create a fertile ground for laws to change. But the culture, because it moves faster, and moving faster as in 10 to 15 years faster, we have to also allow it to sort of move at the speed it will move and not get discouraged by the slower changes that will happen in the political and economic realm. But I share this because when we're thinking about advocacy, it's not just about getting our elected candidates to act on something. That's part of it. But so much about it is around creating the ideas, the images, the vision of the world we want to see. And that is because in our social justice sector, whether it's because of climate chaos or whether it's because of gender inequality, our movements are very much stuck. So we need to help provide a vision for the future. I also like to think about the realm of culture as a galaxy, right? And so this is a great analogy for you all to think about the power of, the images that your artists make, or the stories or the songs. And that is that each story is a star, right? A song, an image that you see on the street, maybe a poster by ACT UP, some of the images that artists are doing now. These are all stars. And the more cultural output that we have about this, whether it's videos or stories or content on social media, we begin to form constellations. And those constellations, I like to think about them as narratives, right? We begin to normalize narratives. And there comes a point when you see the constellation so bright that it can no longer be ignored. And that is our power in the realm of the creation of art and culture, is that we can help people see things in another way that they may not have seen before, and we can help lead to narrative shift, right? So that stories are like stars, and narratives are these connected stories, and culture is the galaxy in which we play, and it's always moving and expanding. It also in the cultural realm is that often when we think of social change, again, political activism, we think about action, right? We think about something that has to be passed or something that we have to win. And often those things are about the no, right? What we don't want. We don't want deportation. We don't want police brutality. We don't want reproductive rights taken away from us. We don't want our classrooms to not have art. But what do we want? What does our yes look like? In our advocacy, it's critical to also help show the vision of what a yes can look like. And this is what I call the realm of ideas, right? And how do we show, for example, if we're working to create a world in which gender inclusion is normalized, what does that look like? What does that feel like? How do we help people imagine that? So the moment we are in now, if there was a moment for arts and culture strategy, it is now. And the reason for that is because never before have we been in such a global culture shift moment. And so many of the stories that kept our societies together, and those stories are economic stories, they're stories about our political system, those stories are failing now. And the devastating impact of our extractive economy, the cost on people and the planet is so evident. And so collectively, even if we think about ourselves in the United States, rapidly the stories of what held us together are becoming unraveled, and we are understanding that our healthcare system is ineffective. We actually do not have the social safety net to care for our most vulnerable. And for those of us who work in the creation of culture, this is really our moment, because Naomi Klein talks about this, is that when you have systems go into a moment of chaos, that you have an opportunity to present a different view of the world that you want to see. And because so many people in our communities are, struggling to understand what's happening, they are looking for comfort, they are looking for sense making. Artists can do that. We can show that. And we could also help introduce ideas and help people imagine what systems of care can look like, right? And I'll give you an example of that. You know, for centuries, the work of caretaking has been seen as women's work. It's unpaid labor. And it's been largely relegated to the domestic space. And now, because of COVID, care is front and center. It's so clear that we need to prioritize the caretaking, both paid labor and unpaid labor, that really sustains our social fabric. And so how do we help create that idea into a possible win? Because the other reality is that, you know, we're a few months before the election. In this moment, people are forming new ideas about what they need, what they deserve, and what they want for their communities. And so artists, our ability to help shape that is significant right now. And so while I recognize and I feel, you know, both as an artist myself and as a leader, just a very harsh impact on our ability to sustain ourselves, and I know that our arts sector will not be the same. I also invite us to really stand in our power as cultural creators and think about how we can really look towards contributing to systemic social change by imagining and visualizing what a future can look like. And I will be sharing some examples of how my organization is doing that. I want to show you some images here that emerged in mid-March, between the period of March 17th and March 23rd, of how rapidly artists were responding to the moment. Never in my lifetime would I have imagined that we could get people out of prison. You know, I'm an abolitionist. We partner a lot with organizations who are ending mass incarceration and who are working to get people out of immigrant detention center, including mothers and children. And never would we have imagined that culture would shift so fast that we would see a time when people were releasing prisoners. And this is, again, the moment we are in, is that this is actually possible, right? And so the ability for artists to move fast and to create informational graphics that help demand this is very key to winning. And so this art by Micah Bazant was very popular during mid-March, and it helped activate people together with some of the frontline organizing that anti-incarceration groups were doing. Of course, you all have now seen the normalization of having eviction moratoriums, of, you know, supporting tenants. That, again, artists have helped normalize that, both artists who create artwork, but also, you know, you have a lot of social media influencers who are also talking about this. And then, of course, there's the valuing of work that we have traditionally called low-skilled work, and how we recognize now as a country the very important value that these workers have, whether it's nurses or food workers or post office workers, construction workers. And I really think, you know, I've been involved in the Fight for 15. My organization has supported workers at Walmart, because Walmart is the largest employer of Black and Latinx workers in the world. It's Walmart. So what the trends they set dramatically impact our communities. And for years, there's been a fight for 15, right? A fight for living wage. And now, as you can all see, workers going on strike, that shift is very possible. And so how do we provide opportunities for artists to contribute to that? Because, you know, what's good for our communities, what's good for frontline workers means that we are building more resilient communities. And all of us as artists belong to resilient communities. Not to mention that the median income in the United States just a few years ago for artists was $30,000 a year, which is about $15 an hour. And so there's a lot of similarities with low-wage workers and artists. So I point this out also to emphasize that culture moves faster than politics. I'm not sure, I don't think I can play this from my, probably can't. This was a little video I had animated. It's an endless scroll of art. I will share this when you all get the slides, you can see this, but it's over a minute of scrolling through the hundreds and hundreds of images that have been created in less than 1 month from artists. Despite artists being dramatically impacted, they are comforting us, they are showing us stories, and they are helping to verbalize and image back to us the kind of world that we want to see. So what are we doing as an organization to pivot? So first is that because we are in the Bay Area and we are right near tech, right? Our organization was closely observing what the tech industry was doing. And in early March, the tech industry began sending people home. And so we began sending people home as well, right? And we were not looking to our federal government. We were looking to the sector that has workers all around the world and that has enough privilege to be able to catch trends before we did. And so we began to pivot by doing our best to move all of our engagement to digital engagement and recognizing also that so much of the work that we do around culture shift and advocacy around particular social justice issues, that we were going to move into a time of just an abundance of narrative possibilities and that digital strategies were going to need to increase in order to meet that demand. So I'm going to share with you the three key things that we are doing. So first is that providing a framework for artist activation. So as soon as our shelter in place was announced, we began working on an action guide in partnership with social movement organizations. So we have been in conversation with the National Domestic Workers, with various labor organizations, climate change organizations, to think about, hey, what are you all seeing in your narrative landscape that we can get out to artists? Because the thing is that although artists obviously we have lost many of our sources of income, including, our ability to play in venues, our ability to do our speaking engagements, even, personally, my art sales have dropped entirely. There is another opportunity, which is that we all have fan bases, right? We have people who follow us, and we have the tool, which is we create culture. And so to be able to plug artists in to opportunities to engage and advocate, I think really is, not only is it it's fulfilling to us as artists, but it also allows us to be part of a conversation and get our art out to a massive amount of people. So we started working on story pillars, right? And some of those story pillars are things like, we're not going back, right? Demanding health care for all without exceptions, right? That means we don't have an exception for prisoners. We don't have exceptions for undocumented immigrants. All of them deserve health care. Our guide will also highlight resources, including like the most recent Artist Relief Fund that came out, and it will help build a creative community of mutual support. And that is that as artists, as we are partnering artists with some of these issues, they will get to know some of these organizations, and so we're creating the environment so that artists are beginning partnerships with social justice organizations. And that's always been our mandate, but now that is needing to scale rapidly. And again, because there's a lot of amazing frontline demands that are coming out. If you all check out the People's Bailout, which includes also a demand to provide economic relief for all working people. It includes a green stimulus, right, which is transitioning away from a fossil fuel economy towards a regenerative green economy. All of those things we sort of bundled into different pillars that would make it digestible so that artists could easily see how they could create content. We are the recommendations are being designed for artists of all genres. So we support activities for musicians, video makers, social media artists, performers, and we've also been experimenting with doing IG Lives with our artists. In both of our IG Lives, each artist was able to raise at least $600 within an hour of performing. So this is the first one. The second thing is we need to get money to artists now. And so we are paying artists to help us envision the future. And so we are, through our guide, we are providing direct commissions around what are some of these issue areas, and we are also increasing our commissions for our key issue areas, because again, all of these issues are very, they're flaring right now. So because of the stay-at-home orders, there's a spike in violence against domestic violence, right? And so our partners in the domestic violence realm are looking to us to help create content. And because now everything is shifting over to digital engagement, a lot of these organizations need more content and want to work with artists. And so it's an opportunity to get artists paid. And we also are administering an Artist Disruptor Relief Fund. It's $100,000. We got initial donations from folks in entertainment like Jill Soloway and Lena Waithe. And the fund is through nominations. Our friends over at SOZE did an open call, and they received 6,000 applications, and we do not have the infrastructure to do open call. So we are taking a cue from our friends at the Libra Foundation and doing a nomination process that prioritizes Indigenous artists, disabled artists, women of color artists, immigrant artists, and trans and non-binary artists. And finally is that our civic engagement infrastructure. So we have partners who are doing a lot of work around electoral engagement, and that includes organizations like Way to Win, who are an organization based in the South. We are prioritizing activation in areas in which women of color leadership is abounding. That includes states like Georgia, Michigan, Florida, precisely because we are a racial justice organization. We look to partner with organizations, electoral organizations that align with our values. And what we've learned is that in order to get young people out to vote, we absolutely need genuine and authentic digital content. And we learned that, I mean, even to get, for AOC to get elected, Ayanna, if you studied how they reached out to their base, a lot of it was through non-traditional, communication strategies, like using Instagram as a storytelling platform, or working with, the DIY video makers. And second is that together with 3 other organizations, Harness, which was founded by America Ferrera and largely organizes actors in entertainment, Illuminative, which was founded by Crystal Echohawk, largely organizing Indigenous artists, and The League, started by Tracy Sturdivant. We are launching Culture Surge, and that is designed to be a cultural strategy table for the 2020 election, because there are many movement strategy tables, but there's actually not a cultural strategy table, and our goal is going to be to coordinate distributed efforts so that we are communicating effectively with artists, influencers, celebrities who want to engage their fan bases. And while there's been many different organizations working with artists, there's actually not a national infrastructure to align these efforts and also to be in coordination with other movement tables. So with that, I'll close it out again with reinforcing that we as artists, as a cultural community, we have the opportunity to share another gaze, to share another perspective that will ultimately shift worldview. And perspective matters. Gaze matters. When we have, whether it's like Black artists who are speaking from their impacted communities, or immigrant artists who are sharing their stories, those things move people. We know that art and culture speak to people's emotions. They literally create chemicals in our brain that makes us more able and willing to take an action. And so how our ability to empower artists, to increase their leadership, to increase their knowledge in how they can engage in this space is going to make a big difference in whether we win. So thank you so much, everyone. Looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you both. That was fantastic. I don't want to go too much into all of the things that were so great because then I'll be here forever and we'll never get to Q&A, but thank you so much, both of you. The nuts and bolts of the advocacy and lobbying was great. A few folks did actually reach out during the presentation asking about the 501h expenditure test, so we'll follow up with more information on that. And I know a few folks want to see the short film, I'll call it a short film, Favianna, of the artist's work. So we'll make sure to send that out. But to dive into the questions, I want to follow up with you on this, Favianna. A lot of folks, as we know, in the midst of COVID-19, are switching to digital engagement and more digital activation. So what type of shift should funders be thinking about in the midst of that and having to make those types of decisions? What type of technical assistance pivots would need to be made? What are some strategies to make the sector a little bit more resilient given the responses needed for general operating support, plus still funding artists?
Yes, that's a great question. So first is that to recognize that communication strategy is different than cultural strategy, right? And that the power of cultural strategy is the ability to activate storytelling, right? The ability to test out how different mediums work in terms of reaching audiences. The first thing I would recommend is that the organization have a social media staff person or a social media team. And those social media teams include content creation and messaging, right? Because social media is not like a side thing. It actually, we have a team of 4 people doing social media that's their full-time job. And social media is also what the content you can create on Instagram. It's about creating opportunities to engage with your audience. It's not just a one-facing, a one-directional facing thing. It's about creating opportunities to cultivate conversation, dialogue, engagement, the ability to measure, right? Second is an analysis of the digital tools that exist for that organization. Do they have Salesforce? Do they have programs to email and track how their audience is engaging? Are they able to transition their accounts to business accounts so that they can get better insights, for example, or data that helps them make better decisions? Third is I also think that exploring online advocacy tools and tools in which you are able to create petitions or partner. Color of Change actually has a really excellent tool for people of color to create petitions that you can partner with, and their systems are so robust that it's hard for an arts organization to create a system like that, but partnering with organizations that can help do digital advocacy and also transitioning to strong online donation systems. Online donation systems also mean systems to be able to track those donors, right? And that could mean something like Salesforce. And then finally, I would say is I think a lot of organizations are going to need help with how to transition to a webinar style or digital-based presentation tools. There's a lot of great organizations in our cultural sector that do things like Howl, I forgot their full name, Howl something, StreamYard, actually what we're using now, Adobe Connect, but the ability to be able to find the right thing for your audience so that you could continue reaching your artists and your fans is a critical part of a digital transition.
That's great. Thank you so much. You offered a lot of tips that I know folks will find very useful. And sort of similarly, I'd like to address the question to you, Abby, just in terms of tips to support advocacy efforts to grantees that you've heard or that you might offer from your perspective that Favianna might not have mentioned.
Sure. I think she talked about a lot, and as we're hearing, organizations are really grappling with how to move their activities online. And right now we're in the midst, what seemed like was going to be the big story of 2020 was the election, and this big election that's coming up, hopefully, that will happen in November. And how do we get people engaged? How do we get people voting? But how do we get people communicating with candidates? And so now that there are not in-person events, now that they're not town halls, how groups are really struggling with how do they keep their message front and center? How do they communicate with the elected officials, with the candidates, and with the community, and how to do that online? And so we've been talking with a lot of groups about how they can, sort of learning how to better, how to move some of their activity into the online space. And so I think that's probably the biggest area. And I think, as we talked about a little earlier, for so many of the funders have already been doing this, which has been amazing, is really looking at how to get more money out the door, how to simplify the process, and how to be as flexible as possible. And, this is sort of a great example of nobody expected us to, this country, the world to be in this situation, and could not have prepared for it. And so how are groups able to respond as flexibly as possible is just so important. And having those good relationships with funders really makes that possible.
Right, yes, and relationships are key. That's something that we talk about, I think, all the time as part of the solution. I think Favianna, the resource that or the group that you were referring to that you were blanking on the name for, How I Round Theater Commons, I think that's the group the name you were looking for then. And also follow another question that either of you can respond to. One of our guests asks, can you speak about racial equity and offer suggestions to funders on what's possible if we engage a racial equity / justice lens with our funding? How is this a social justice issue?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I was thinking about this especially for the culture sector. So first is that any kind of issue that affects us as human beings in this country is usually affecting people of color and indigenous people, Black people specifically, and indigenous people in much harsher ways. And those inequalities are front and center right now. I mean, the amount of Black people you have dying from COVID is really a sign of medical racism, right? The fact that in a lot of these meat processing plants, right? The amount of COVID infections is massive, and guess who works in the plants? Immigrants. There's just been a proposal by the president to decrease the wages of farm workers, and we know that COVID is a gendered crisis. I mean, most of the frontline workers are women, people working in food, in care, so we can't disconnect race, unfortunately, because our country is built upon a system of racial capitalism in which the most vulnerable are exploited, and the most vulnerable are exploited because of their race. And so I think that right now it's evident, it's right in front of us, and so as cultural organizations, we actually have the opportunity. I mean, we're in the midst of a shift, and that shift must include equity, and it must include inclusion, because I believe that the most resilient organizations are actually organizations that are run by people of color and that serve people of color. And that is because as communities of color, we have already been sidelined. We have already been impacted. When I see around me the cultural sector, the leadership of women of color, it's truly outstanding. And, as a few days ago, the Burning Man organization announced that they would be canceling the event, and I lead a people of color camp there, And I really thought to myself, like, wow, you know, these huge festivals are all now being, you know, they're being canceled, whether it's South by Southwest or Coachella or Burning Man. And I was thinking, this is actually an opportunity for them to really look at themselves and see, is this who we want to be? Are we going to be we need to reinvent ourselves and think about how can we create cultural gatherings that are truly inclusive in which all people can belong? Mm-hmm. And how do we emerge from this through almost like in a rebirth in a way that actually can speak to our shared values? And I think that, you know, when you have 45 even point at the disparities of how much people are dying and the impact, I think racial equity is something we can no longer ignore and walk away from. And I think that it should be a key component in how organizations look to become more resilient and to transform, so that when we get through this, we are actually in a better place to serve all people in our country.
That's great. Thank you. I want to acknowledge that it is the top of the hour past 1 minute. So for those who have to run, I appreciate you coming. I do want to ask one final question for you, Abby, just because when it comes down to it, I think a lot of people might be wondering this question. The question is, my board is nervous about advocacy. How can I start the conversation? Because I think people are trying to kind of pick up and move these things along now more than ever. So what would you say to those folks?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think it really touches on what Favianna was talking about in terms of culture change and sort of shaping hearts and minds. And I think in many cases it's breaking down the language and not leading the conversation with, we need to do more advocacy, but rather look at and start with your grantees who are hurting, starting with sort of what are the changes you need, and say what are some ways, you know, as a foundation that are committed to the arts or committed to arts education, whatever your portfolio is, what are some ways that we need to, how can we best support our grantees, and have a really broad brainstorming session, and then in many cases come back and say, you know what, a lot of these are advocacy, or sometimes maybe you don't even have to call it advocacy. But a lot of it is, I think for so many people, when they think of advocacy, they immediately think of the most controversial, and they think of all these laws, and they think of all this scary stuff, instead of that advocacy can be writing a report, doing some data right now showing the impact of how many of your grantees have had to lay off staff, and the economic burden that's having. How many kids are now not able to get music education, and what does that mean for their future? And all of those are advocacy, and so I think in many cases it's really reframing it and sort of unpacking that word that carries so much baggage with it too often, and really looking at the activities, looking at what your grantees need, and going backwards from there.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm sad that I have to say we reached the end of our presentation. I feel like it's just getting to, like, you know, so juicy, but we are at the end, and I do want to thank both of you, Favianna and Abby, for your time and your presentation. And for those who attended, we will be sending out the follow-up with a recording of this presentation and the slides, and we'll make sure to include some additional resources from the presenters as well. Additionally, we do invite you to take a brief survey that we will share immediately following the webinar, so you can let us know what you thought, if you have any follow-up questions. And then you'll also notice that we have included the contact info of the presenters, so you can feel free to reach out to them directly if you have questions. And lastly, we hope that you are staying healthy and well in this very rough time. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions, or just to reach out about anything that you're doing in response to COVID-19 that you would like to hear our thoughts on. And again, we thank you for joining us today. Have a great day, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.